think it's time I finally addressed the situation in Shanghai. After all, China is, from my perspective, the most important player in the global economy. At least if you are someone in the West. Or, you know what? I guess, well, no. I mean, really, I think it's all the West. It's not just the United States. China has become the global manufacturing powerhouse that is undisputed at this point. And so when there is instability in China, when we are seeing lockdowns of tens of millions of people across China, perhaps hundreds of millions, that's a big deal. We're seeing a bottleneck of ships piling up in the ports in China. Commerce is not moving. And of course, we're seeing a lot of videos of people starting to get a little rowdy. I try and filter out anything that to me feels too much like propaganda from the other side. You always have to watch out when you're looking at stuff about another country. There's always going to be a tendency to exaggerate the negative stuff. But even with that filter in place, it's clear something bad's going on in Shanghai. It's not a fun time there right now. China's not denying what they're doing there. They've got people locked up in their apartments. They're not allowed to leave. If you get sick, you get sent to the gulag, to the Kuf camp, as we called them back in January and February of 2020, when all this first started in China. And, there were a lot of people who at the time said, oh, don't fall for this. China's just trying to overreact and put out these scary images and fool us all into locking down. That's what a lot of people said, especially on the right back then. I never really bought into that. I don't think that the Chinese engage in performative totalitarianism. I think that that's really just who they are. I mean, they still have that giant painting of Mao, in the Forbidden City. They've never made a break with, the horrible past. I mean, you have to remember, Mao, as far as any leader in the world is concerned, killed more people than anyone. Killed way more than the terrible, awful Adolf Hitler that they love to talk about so much. He killed more than Stalin. And the Chinese government celebrates this man to this day and venerates him. So you think that they're not, that they would just, for sport, put out these videos and stage things and, try and make it seem like they're overreacting and scare the West? No, I think that's just the natural response of the people who lead China. I think that they think of their citizens as cattle. And, they are subjects. They are lower than royal subjects in an old monarchy. And so, it's not so hard for me to believe the Chinese do bad things to their people. Now, some of the things, when we talk about like the Uyghur stuff, I do think that's that has gone beyond the level of substantiated claims. There have been some extraordinary claims made about the Chinese and the Uyghurs that just don't make a lot of sense. But the stuff in Shanghai and the lockdown stuff in general in China just it all rang true to me at the time. The CCP really is just that afraid of people getting sick. And they feel like they have the political capital and, and the latitude to treat people this way and to get away with it. Because, they've been able to get away with it since 1949 when, Mao consolidated, all of mainland China. And if you look at things, on net from the bottom I guess it was in the 60s, 50s, 60s, during the Great Leap Forward to now, China's made incredible advancements. And they of course would attribute that all to their wonderful leadership, if people asked. And so they feel like, no matter what they do at this point, hey, things are so much better than they were during the Great Leap Forward. And certainly, oh my gosh, so much better than they were during the, the warlord period, that essentially we can do whatever we want, and people should be thankful to us. Chinese authorities demand respect from, the average person in China, and they get it through, I think, largely, well, no, not even largely through fear. I think that they get a lot of it through people who genuinely buy into it and think that, hey, we have improved so much as a society because of the great, wise leadership of the Communist Party, and essentially we don't want to rock the boat. I think it's natural for Westerners to look at what goes on in China and to think, oh my gosh, this is terrible. People will rise up against this. Nobody would tolerate that. And they're showing, these little riots that are breaking out in Shanghai because people are hungry or whatever. I would be very skeptical of predictions like that. People in China and people in the West, even as much as, I criticize the average person in the West for being a bootlicker, who worships at the altar of authority, Westerners still do have their limits. Westerners are incredibly spoiled in terms of their living standards, particularly Americans. And they're willing to tolerate a lot of abuse so long as it doesn't affect their standard of living. But the Chinese are different. I think that the Chinese, they never really had a culture of individual freedom or human dignity. And I don't mean that as an insult to Chinese people, but I mean just in my experience of meeting people who are from actually from China, not quote unquote Chinese people in America. I mean people from China who I've met. They have a very different attitude. They don't believe in civil rights. It's just not something. It's totally foreign to them. Okay, so they don't have this inherent idea that hey, I have rights, and the government is violating my rights. They don't believe that, and so they're willing to put up, with a lot of crap from the state because they essentially believe that they have no recourse. And practically speaking, they're right. They don't have any recourse against the state, unless you had hundreds of millions of people in China rise up all at once. And that didn't even happen under the Great Leap Forward. I had a Chinese professor in college, and she was by no means a commie, but she also wasn't, some, rabid rabid Chinese dissident or something like that. She still had family in China, and the way that she explained it to me, the Great Leap Forward, was that even though people who lived during the Great Leap Forward was the worst experience of their lives, they'd never been poor, things had never been worse. The general consensus was still that they felt that they were better off than before Mao came along and before communism, because they felt like they at least had some dignity. They felt like they were a part of something greater. And who knows? Maybe she's just buying into the Chinese propaganda. But this was someone who acknowledged that the Great Leap Forward is a bad thing and that lots of people died and that it was terrible. But the attitude in China, and at least even if this wasn't true at the time, this is how people think of it now. That no matter how bad it was, nonetheless, it was their duty to endure it, and they were proud to do so. That's a way of thinking that's completely foreign to me. Just as my way of thinking is completely foreign to them. That's okay. Some societies are incompatible. That doesn't mean that we can't trade with each other, but it certainly does mean that we can't pretend to share one society. We don't live by the same rules. At the end of the day, societies at large, and I don't like to ascribe, collective blame, but I'm basically doing that here. Societies get the government that they deserve. And the Chinese, you might look at them and say, oh, well, they're prisoners of the CCP. They're stuck under the yoke of the Reds. Well, first and foremost, the Chinese are prisoners of their own minds, from my perspective. They don't look at it that way. They don't see themselves, as prisoners. They are content living as subjects. They have a very different idea of human dignity than I do. And I can't just come along and pretend like I know what's best for that kind of a society. I can look at what goes on in China and say that I find it abhorrent, but I can't say that what the Chinese are doing is universally abhorrent. It's not something that's considered abhorrent there. People in China largely support this. Obviously, there's dissidents. It's a society of, what is it, over 2 billion people. There's probably more people in China who think like I do than there are in the United States, just because there's so many people in China. But nonetheless, they're an infinitesimal minority. At the end of the day, if the Chinese didn't largely support the CCP and the things that they do, either the CCP would do different things, or the CCP would no longer be in power. They would not be able to hold on to power. Whether you have elections or not, you still rely on the consent of the governed, because people have to be willing to go along with what you're doing. There's a very, very small, if you think about the amount of people who make up the state, it's a very, very small number of people in any society. Yet everyone is supposed to do what they say. Obviously, if even a small fraction of society decided to say no to the rules and to the orders of the rulers would be gone. And so the rulers are constrained by what the ruled society, by what the occupied people are willing to tolerate. And that's why long term, I'm fairly optimistic about the future of the United States, because I do think that there's a lot of bad stuff that could happen here in America that simply won't be tolerated. Americans do not have an attitude of wanting to cooperate with one another. In fact, they have contempt for the idea of having to compromise what they want, for the sake of the greater good and for what other people might want, who are different, who have different interests than they do. That, I think, is a good thing. But in China, that sort of thinking is a bad thing, and people don't respect that. They don't think that way. They think that it is virtuous to be a cog in the wheel and to go along to get along. And it's true to a certain extent. If you see trying to organize 2.3 billion people towards very specific common goals is a good thing. To me, I value freedom much more than that. In fact, I think it's much better when people go around doing what they want for themselves. I think that we create a lot more good things, both spiritual, emotional, physically. We create more goods in the economy. We create happier communities when people do what they want. And so I don't see the downfall of the Chinese Communist Party and their government coming anytime soon. Now, I could be completely wrong about that. They could fall in the next 6 months, and I could look like a big idiot. I'd be happy if that were the case, because I'm fairly certain. There's a lot of usually when people call for regime change, and I'm not calling for regime change in China by any means, but usually when people do, the unintended consequences, if they ever get their wish, normally result in an even worse regime being installed. Whatever was wrong about the previous regime, things almost universally, and I can't think of any case where this isn't true, get worse after the regime is changed. But in the case of China, I can't really think of, what could be worse. I mean, obviously, if China was like full North Korea, if they were full Stalinist, that would be worse. But I really don't think it'd be likely if, the current Chinese government fell. I don't think the result would be, some kind of Stalinist regime. I don't think that it would be something worse than what they currently have. And what they currently have is, if you extrapolate, when you consider the number of people, the percentage of the global population that is under the domain of the current Chinese government, they are worse than North Korea in that sense, because even though, it's a lower grade tyranny than what you have in North Korea, it's affecting, exponentially more people. But it doesn't really matter what I think would happen if this government were to be dissolved, if the government never actually dissolves, and I don't think that it will. The Chinese government has presided over a rapid economic expansion in that country over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. People there are much richer than they used to be. Their wealth has grown, and their standards of living have risen to such a degree that I think that would create an incredible amount of goodwill amongst large swaths of the population. And so unless the Chinese did something to really set that backwards, to reverse that, I don't think that they're going to encounter much trouble. And no, that's not to say that I think sanctions on China, if it were to so-called supposedly cripple their economy, if that would bring them down. No, that wouldn't do it either, because I don't think it has to come from within. They can't, you can't put sanctions on a country and then expect the citizens to blame their own government. They're going to blame the country that sanctioned them. Right now the Biden administration is trying to, they're spinning this Putin price hike thing, narrative, trying to front run tomorrow's catastrophic CPI print, which I will be covering. Although I don't want to talk about inflation today because we don't know what the exact number is yet, but they're front running this. They're talking about now tomorrow's going to be very bad because of the Putin price hike, you see. Tomorrow's CPI number is going to be, substantially worse compared to February. Not because of Putin's price hike, but because of Biden's price hike, because of the sanctions that the West is imposing on Russia. Russia's not the one sanctioning the West. And so, if there's some war between China and Taiwan, China goes in, they march into Taiwan. Taiwan's an island. China can just surround them and isolate them, and bomb them until they surrender. That's going to be very popular amongst the population of mainland China, seeing the government reconstitute, the empire back to its former glory. But we're supposed to believe that, if China gets the Russia treatment and the U.S. decides to abstain from importing goods from China, which, it's just unthinkable at this point. It would be that would be the end of America. We would not be able to consume anything. I've said a lot of things would be the end of America, and that's not, hyperbole. It's just there's a lot of the United States is the one that's very unstable right now, and I see a lot of things that could trigger the end. That's not to say that any one of these things would happen, or can, or will happen. These are things that can happen. These are things to watch out for, that when you see them, you duck and cover. And I think the U.S. is under the impression that if they were to sanction China, that somehow China would be the ones who are harmed by that. It's kind of like when Trump was talking about, I'm doing a lot of damage to China with my tariffs. And it's like, oh, you mean that those tariffs that are paid for by American consumers? Yeah, I'm sure the Chinese are real beat up over that. Because at the end of the day, the Chinese still have the stuff that they produce. And if they're, cut off by the United States, let's say okay, so what does that mean? That means that their dollar income is going to drop. That might cause some financial stress in the Chinese system, although I think that China's been trying to move away from the dollar for a very long time. But nevertheless, let's just say it will cause some pain. Not only will that pain be minimal compared to the pain felt domestically in the United States by those sanctions, but the people in China, to the extent that they feel any pain from this at all, will realize, hey, this is America doing this to us. trying to punish us for handling our own affairs, because that's how they view the Taiwan issue. They don't think that that's any of America's business. And so all this will only strengthen the current regime. And so again, I say none of this with glee. You know, I would like, personally, and I don't like saying this because it sounds so arrogant of me as someone who's, not Chinese, not from China, has no plans of visiting China, to say what I think their government should be. But I mean, really, it does trouble me to see that people have to live under these conditions, even if it is, halfway around the world. I do wish that there could be a different state of affairs within China. But that's just not feasible at this point. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.